It's my pleasure to have a conversation with my colleague, James Robinson. He's a university professor at the University of Chicago. I'm Anup Malani. I'm a professor at the University of Chicago Law School. So let me first begin by introducing James. He's an incredibly well-known scholar. I think the thing that makes James so impressive is not merely that he tackles the most fundamental questions in economic development, and that he has a very strong voice, a particular viewpoint that has been very, very influential over the years, but also he applies a methodology that I think is something for lots of scholars, including young scholars like myself, to aspire to, which is that he's able to bring a combination of qualitative work in the field work and quantitative, very rigorous statistical methodology together to make arguments. He's also quite brutally honest with his own work. He is, to a fault, actually very self-critical, which also makes it fantastic. Gives you also a lot more faith in the work that he does. So with that background, let me go ahead and begin the conversation by talking about the talk that you gave last night. It was a talk on institutional capacity. In particular, state capacity, the capacity of government to implement policies or to implement a particular set of institutional features or rules and use them to promote certain policies, including perhaps development. Now, in order to frame this, I want to divide the discussion into 4 parts, if that's okay, because I think it matches nicely with the framework that you set up. So within state capacity, you had divided things into the desire or need for state capacity on the one hand, and the second is strategies for achieving state capacity, for building state capacity. So I want to talk about state capacity in those 2 ways, but then I want to take it further because I know that you focused your talk last night on state capacity, but your writing is much more broad, and in particular, kind of the most notable area that you write in is institutions and the importance of institutions for development, which overlap a little bit with state capacity, but may not be identical. So I want to have a discussion about your views of the relation between state capacity and institutions and toss some ideas out there. And then the last one is I want to push forward and ask you to think about, okay, it would be wonderful to have state capacity, but what happens if state capacity fails? How should we think about policy in that context? So let's maybe we can structure this around these first 4 things. So let's start with the first topic, which is the desire or need for state capacity. So the standard view, or one of the standard views, is that war is a big driver. That if your society for a long period of time is engaged in conflict, you have a need to build state capacity, and so you build state capacity. It's a need-based argument. It's also been used. We're here in Goa, so it's helpful to talk a little bit about India. But we in India will often do a contrast between China and India, and one of the theories for why China may have better state capacity than India is that China over the centuries has had to engage in a lot of warfare, and that has caused it to build up state capacity in a way that India, insulated by the Himalayas, may not have as much of that need and didn't. But I know you're critical of that view, so I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, yes, I mean, I'm sure that there are historical moments or historical episodes where, the threat of interstate warfare led to the creation of state capacity. But, if I thought about, Britain, which I was talking about last night, which is supposed to be a sort of canonical case for this, the ironic thing is that the emergence of the modern state occurs in the period where Britain completely drops out of interstate warfare. There's this long period of the 100 Years' War with France. And then in 1485, the Tudors come, and that's a period where they're fighting the French, more or less endlessly. But it's also a period where there's essentially what the British historians call bastard feudalism, which is actually a kind of reversal of state capacity, a kind of deinstitutionalization of the central state and a movement back towards kind of feudal barons and warlords with their own armies and fighting it out. And then the Tudors come in and they just kind of check out of the whole interstate warfare, as do the Stuarts. When the 30 Years' War happens in the 17th century, the British basically just do nothing. At some point, they send some ships to France. But, the whole of Europe was being ravaged. The British just sat and did nothing. But that's the whole period where you have the Tudor revolution of government, a lot of centralization, the demilitarization of the aristocracy, the excise tax, like there's all sorts of state building going on in this period where Britain is not fighting anybody. And then, of course, it's true after 1688 that there's all this state building, fiscal system, etc., professionalization of the military, Bank of England, national debt, and then they start fighting aggressively with France. But what's causing what? To me, that's a complete choice. It's a political decision to build this bureaucracy after 1688, and Parliament decides to do it because they can control it for the first time. So, and the reason they do it is because there's a political project, and the political project involves, it involves empire, it involves intensifying this conflict with France, and so, to me, that's a choice. It makes it very difficult to say anything causally about, there's more a political project, and that's, the way I tend to think about it. And I think, in the modern, what I was saying last time is, whatever happened historically in the, the last century, of course you can think of like Japan, for example, the Meiji Restoration, where there's this threat of suddenly these American warships appear in Tokyo Harbor. And they realize how backward technologically they are. That precipitates a sort of civil war and internal struggle, which again leads to state formation. It leads to the creation of a modern state, the adoption of all sorts of institutions. So maybe that's another example where this kind of, relative backwardness compared to the West precipitates this institutional innovation. But I think you can also think of many modern examples of state building, which cannot possibly have been precipitated by that. Mauritius, Barbados, Botswana, successful countries in the, Tunisia, for example, after independence. So there's actually many more recent examples that don't seem to have been precipitated by interstate warfare. And I think, we were talking last night. There's many sorts of mechanisms, it seems, that could lead to the creation of these things. So I tend to think about it in terms of a political project, and in some context that can involve this issue of interstate warfare. But for every example of interstate warfare that leads to state formation, I can cite 10, where it didn't. So I think a lot of it is kind of cherry picking examples.
So now, just push this forward a little bit further. In order to understand what drives the building of state capacity, warfare doesn't explain it all the time, but it could be one of several different factors that weigh in. A really interesting one. Well, first of all, I'd like you to think about propose so many hypotheses you might have about the other ones, but one in particular I'd like you to touch on is think about Meiji Japan, the story about the American ship showing up and the Japanese realizing, okay, we have to build state capacity if we're going to deal with this. We're going to compete, not necessarily go to war. That's actually, in some sense, heartening for a country like India, where a lot of the push to have improved state capacity, build out tax bases, modernize the bureaucracy is actually driven by, look, we have to compete with China, not militarily, but look, they've grown so much, we need to keep up and keep up that rate of growth. So that's very similar. There may be other examples of that, but I wanted to get your thoughts on that and any other kind of regularities you might see, or whether there's just too little sample size to really tell right now.
Well, one of the things I was trying to emphasize last night is that, this is not something we understand very well. I think we understand the strategizing. Like, once you're committed to trying to build state institutions, I think we sort of understand quite a bit about the likely problems and some of the strategies you can use to overcome the problems, which may or may not work in a particular context. But I think what I was trying to illustrate last night is there's many things we don't really understand about this impulse to kind of build institutions. We can sort of say, James Madison, what was he thinking about, in the United States, after they'd won their independence from the US? Well, he was worried. He was worried about the English reinvading, maybe. He was worried about, the kind of maintaining the autonomy of the United States. He was worried about populism as well, and keeping populism under control, by the way. So that's why they wanted to unify the currency, and so there's different motivations. There's kind of domestic motivations of, what sort of society do we want to live in, and and can we get this genie of populism back in the bottle? But there's also, what is it Benjamin Franklin says? We all have to hang together, or we'll hang separately. So there's this idea that we have to coordinate much better. Otherwise, we're very vulnerable as all these little states on our own, kind of competing. And Madison, if you read the Federalist Papers, he talks a lot about the Dutch Republic. That the Dutch Republic was never able to create a unified central state, a unified fiscal system. The small provinces free rode off Holland, which was much larger. So he saw, we don't want all of Switzerland, so he was very aware of the challenges of state building and these other examples which hadn't been so successful. So yes, I think there's different motivations. But I think at the moment we're lacking insight as to exactly, economists. As economists, we tend to think of. I mean, last night I was making this comparison between economic innovation and political innovation. So in economic innovation, we understand that this is driven by mostly by material incentives. People want to get rich, they want to be prosperous, etc. But I'm not sure that political innovation is driven in the same way. James Madison didn't care about becoming rich. Solon didn't care about getting rich. There's other motivations for which I think as economists, it's more difficult for us to deal with because our paradigm is about material incentives. But does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. Although I wouldn't necessarily toss the economists under the bus, because many economists talk about expanding the realm of preferences to include not just consumption, but status and things like that.
Yes.
And it's a healthy move, in fact, and it also helps us communicate a lot with other social scientists that have been there for a long time. Okay, so let's move the train forward. I want to get to the heart of your talk. So assume that there's some reason or desire for state capacity. The core of your talk was about the political strategies that people come up with, the innovations of political strategy to actually build state capacity. So I was wondering, could you share with us some of the, very quickly, the examples that you were giving and some of the, how do we filter that down to a particular strategy or set of strategies that, again, there may not be the same everywhere, but there's some innovation that's involved.
I mean, I was trying to emphasize, the political impediments to state building. And it seems there's two very clear sorts of problems. One is that when you want to build a state, when you want to build a bureaucracy, for example, often you have to deal with very patrimonial institutions where people who are holding government offices are there because of their political connections or because they're the relative of, and you need to replace those people with meritocratically recruited people who are good at the job, who are incentivized, and that's what you see. That's what, when you have state building and bureaucratization, that's always what happens. But that's difficult to happen. It's difficult. It's very political. So how do you deal with that problem? And that's the first problem. And the second problem is state building is very threatening to some people. I was giving the example of after the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688. Building a modern fiscal system was extremely threatening to people who had a lot of assets and had never been taxed before. They didn't like that idea. And so how did you solve that problem? Well, you solved the problem by bureaucratizing the excise tax system, which was taxes on the production of goods, bread, beer, butter, things like this, candles. Very regressive from an economic point of view, the burden falling mostly on poor people. What about land? They didn't bureaucratize the land tax administration. They just left that alone. It was like a way of promising to elites, we're not going to tax land heavily, so this isn't really so threatening to you. So there's these two political problems, and what it seems to me, if I look across these different cases that I was talking about, I talked a little bit about these cases from modern Colombia in Bogota and Medellin in the last 20 years. I talked a little bit about Louis XIV. They all have these problems to deal with, and these two sets of problems. And a very common way of dealing with the first problem is to do things in parallel. You kind of grandfather out the old people, the patrimonial office holders or whatever, and the politically appointed people. You leave them alone, and then you just create a kind of parallel structure. That's what they did in Britain, that's what they did in France, they did that in Ghana recently. In a sense, they did it in South Africa after 1994 as well, after the end of apartheid. They didn't just fire all the white bureaucrats in the state. They left them alone, and they brought in Africans, to kind of, so there was a clever transformation of the state, and these existing people also, they have knowledge and they have skill. You want to use what they have too. So that that's one strategy, and the other, so you have to deal with these two political problems. And I was just trying to talk about the different ways in which people had dealt with these sort of political problems and political opposition, the sort of strategies that it used, but they, emphasizing that they don't always work. It's not that once this desire to build a state appears, it's not true that where there's a will, there's a way, because there's many examples of failed political strategies. There's a lot of uncertainty about what will work in a particular context. So I was just trying to make some generalization about what these political problems look like in these different cases and how they were solved, focusing on, successful cases mostly.
Yeah, I mean, actually, it seems like your theory is actually quite generalizable and touches into, gets into a theory about how institutions, even within states, sometimes build legitimacy. So when you were talking about the examples from last night, I kept on thinking back to Marbury v. Madison in the US, which establishes judicial review, where the Supreme Court of the United States starts out as a weak institution but builds up a lot of strength. And it has this case where one of the parties is the executive, which is the main branch that's going to fight the judiciary and keep it weak. Instead, what it does, Justice Marshall does, is say, okay, we have the power of judicial review and we can cast a judgment over the executive, but in this case, the executive wins. And it's a way to offer the opposition a little bit so that they go along with some usurpation of power, or in the state building capacity, building up of institutions or structures that will enhance the state power in the future, which may be used adversely against those entities in the future. The elites don't always stay the elites generations afterwards.
But it's a very interesting example, that, because in some sense, it's also the case that, the fact that this norm emerged, that there was going to be judicial review of legislation, it looks like it's a weakening of the state, But then it's also, at the same time, you could think dynamically, it's actually helped make the state stronger, because it was credible to people that there was this check and balance on the state. Mm-hmm. So then they were willing to give the state a bit more slack, or maybe give it a bit more resources. So there's an interesting interplay between, the strength of the state and the checks and balances that are kind of imposed on the state.
So on this, I want to bring in another idea. So we're going to touch on institutions and the importance of institutions for economic development. There are some competing theories. One of these theories is that what you need innovation and ideas. And in some sense, your theory brings the two together, because you're talking about political innovations in strategy that help you build state capacity. Now, one issue that comes up in the ideas literature, the thought that innovation matters, is that in a world where ideas flow freely, you don't really have to come up with those ideas yourselves. You can just borrow. And it's really about your ability to implement other people's ideas that help you grow. Can the same thing be said about political strategy? Can politicians in India or in Cambodia or Kenya look to all these historical examples, read your writing, and say, okay, I can learn from what happened in Colombia to figure out what I can do here? I have the desire for state capacity, but now this is the strategy I can borrow. Or do you have to come up with the specific features all yourself?
Well, I suspect that the contexts are very different. So I hope people can learn, from our book. But I mean, one of the challenges in this institutional literature, I think, is, if we're interested in the connection between economic institutions and incentives and innovation, and I look at the labor market, every labor market in the world has sort of idiosyncratic features, trade unions, minimum wage laws, hiring, firing costs, labor coercion, feudalism, bonded labor. There's just everything is different. So you need a set of concepts that sort of cut across all of this and say, all these details are different and important, but here's how you should think about these institutions. They're extractive, or they're inclusive, or whatever. But I think when it comes to designing institutional reform, or understanding the politics of who's the winners, who's opposed to reform, who's in favor of reform, and then all the details suddenly become extremely important. So I think if you were running Cambodia, I'm not sure President Hun Sen, Prime Minister, I don't remember which he is, probably Hun Sen, you know, I'm not sure what he'd have to learn from our book, but you know, I think you could get the idea that, and this is something I was trying to emphasize last night when people asked me to start speculating about India. I think the important lesson is, you know, if India wants to become a prosperous, you know, really developed country, you know, it needs innovation. It needs to tap into all this latent talent in the society, and for that you need these inclusive economic institutions, you know, the rules that really can give broad-based incentives and opportunities to people. And, you know, part of getting to that is going to be constructing a political institutions. And one of those, a key part of that is state capacity. So I think that it's that, you know, if you can get those connections, then perhaps you can develop the motivation to really, yes, gosh, you know, we really need this. So how the heck do we achieve that? And you know, we're going to have much less to say about that in India, you know, where the history and the institutions and all of that, you know, are different from anywhere else in the world. And you know, and you have to come up with a strategy which is sensitive to that context.
So I'm glad you brought up
Yeah.
institutions. That's where I think we should take the conversation next, and compare it to state capacity. I know I tend to think of these two things as distinct, but in order to set up the conversation, I want to just basically situate you in the literature. That is to say, situate your writing in the literature. So there's this debate about why some nations have done so well, and some nations on various metrics, including GDP per capita, have done poorly, and what the prognosis is for the future. And there's a whole bunch of theories that have been discussed. For example, one theory is it's the countries that are able to innovate. We talked about that already. Another theory is that it's the geography of a country or your specific climate that you're in, often associated with Jeffrey Sachs. A third theory is that it's culture. There's a whole number of anthropologists that have proposed this sort of theory, that there's specifics about the culture. There are even theories that suggest that it's human capital. It just depends on how much you invest in education, things like that. But you have a very important voice in this literature, and you've argued, amongst other things, that institutions matter. And it's related to some of those other issues as well, but the core cause is, are you able to develop good institutions? And we'll get to what good is. I want you to describe that a little more, but this can explain a substantial amount of the variation we see across states in their performance. So if you could just take a moment to kind of describe your theory, and then I want to probe the connection between your theory and state capacity.
I think, I mean, a lot of things you're talking about, you know, one of the pivotal moments in my kind of intellectual journey was reading Douglas North and Robert Thomas's The Rise of the Western World when I was an undergraduate at the LSE. And I still get students to read, this 1974 that book came out, I still get the students to read the first chapter in that book. And one of the things they talk about, and it's about institutions and the rise of the West, but one of the things that North and Thomas make this distinction between proximate and fundamental explanations of economic development. And they say, well, you know, the theory of economic growth is about innovation and the accumulation of human capital, but that's not an explanation for growth. That is growth, you know. So why is it that, so it's sort of like, I mean, it's an onion, and you have to peel off the layers of the onion, and I guess the question is, the intellectual question is, you know, which layer are you happy with? So I think when Daron Acemoglu and I, you know, we both read that book, and when we first started working together, you know, 25 years ago, and we both had the same impulse, which was, you know, you can't stop at this layer of saying, oh, it's about human capital accumulation, or Kerala is successful because there's a lot of investment in human capital. Why? You know, why is that? Human capital is not like the monsoon. It's not like rainfall, right? Yeah. It happens because the government decides to invest in schools, individuals decide collectively to build schools, support schools, send their kids to school rather than, you know, to the farm. So we, you know, we'd like to explain. And innovation, same thing. You know, why in England, you know, in the second half of the 18th century, was there an enormous increase in patenting? You know, people suddenly, there was a craze of people were patenting innovations. Why the heck did that happen, you know, then and not, you know, before or afterwards? Or so I think, of course, those things are incredibly important. And, you know, as economists, we've known since Robert Solow's work in the 1950s how important innovation is in driving, you know, long-run productivity and economic growth. we'd like to get, behind that onion, in deeper into the onion. And I think that's where you come to things like the institutional environment, the rules that create incentives, that create investment in human capital or innovation. Or, you get to geography, which is, there's just something fundamentally about a society's geography or ecology that like inhibits productivity or disincentivizes in investment. But I have to say, I always found that theory rather ludicrous. The idea that somehow Africa, is fundamentally impoverished because it's in the tropics, or there's just something about that I find terribly implausible. Or the idea that GDP per capita of Haiti should be 1/40th or 1/50th of the level of the United States. That just doesn't seem, I just don't understand that at all. It's just like you could just have all the same things: investment, education, schools, roads, like you could have that too in Haiti. It's just that the government isn't incentivized to do it, people aren't incentivized to do it, they don't have the opportunity to do it. So I think that we both had this feeling that there was just something completely implausible about this geographical explanation for prosperity. And then we wrote a series of papers trying to show, empirically that the evidence wasn't really consistent with that view. So I mean that was how we were doing other work before that, but this was how we got into this topic of comparison. And one of the motivations for that actually was we both thought Norton Thomas, this is the right explanation. So why aren't economists taking that seriously? They should be taking it seriously. So what can we do to get them to take this seriously? And that was actually part of our motivation. Wasn't just showing that Jeffrey Sachs was wrong, but also it was trying to show here's a this is Norton Thomas was right. This is the right way to think about this this institutional approach. So not that some of these other lessons aren't important, that investing in education is absolutely critical, and how to stimulate innovation, and there can be many market failures, as you're just alluding to, the fact that you can free ride off the creation of ideas. You have an idea, I can use it, but I don't have to create it myself. I can borrow it from you. That's a heck of a lot easier than coming up with it myself. So there's a lot of market failures associated with innovation, and that's not a trivial problem, obviously.
So before we explore institutions a little bit, I just want to quickly stop and say, one of my favorite papers is a paper of yours called talks about the Great Reversal, which is nice both because it answers the argument that the geography is critical that Jeffrey Sachs has been making, but also kind of demonstrates the way that you do work. So it's not merely qualitative work to give examples of situations where two countries are right next to each other. One's doing Barbados and Jamaica, but it also showed your ability to go work with quantitative data historically across a whole range of nations. So could you quickly tell us what the Great Reversal is?
Yeah, well, the motivation for that actually was so we wrote one paper trying to show this colonial origins paper, using colonial history, variation in colonial history, to estimate the causal effect of economic institutions on comparative development. And part of the takeaway from that paper was that once you do this properly, you don't find correlations between latitude and these geographical variables. Like in some sense, the reason that there's a correlation in the raw data between latitude and income per capita is that there's a historical correlation between latitude and the types of colonial societies that appeared. But once you tend to get much more extractive colonial societies in the tropics, and one reason is they were just very unhealthy for white people. So you couldn't have these settler colonies emerging in the tropics. So there was much more emphasis on exploiting indigenous people, extracting resources, not developing institutions. So that but then it struck us at some point. There's this idea that part of the rhetoric of this geography hypothesis was, there's these very enduring correlations, between. But then we thought about the Americas, and we thought that's not true at all. Actually, if you go back 500 years, the places that were poorer were the temperate zones. Southern cone of Latin America, North America. The places which were much more prosperous were the tropics. In Mexico, Central America. That's where they had the developed civilizations. In Peru, that's not in the tropics, but the northern part of the Inca Empire was north of the equator. But Colombia, so we thought, gosh, this is interesting. It's like completely the other way around. And that turns out to be generally true. Actually, it's even true within So what we tried to, that's true within Africa, for example. Southern Africa, was much more, in terms of pre-colonial development, was much less developed than more tropical parts of Africa. So in some sense, what we realized, which we hadn't realized in the previous research, was that one of the impacts of colonialism was to create this enormous reversal. That places which had previously been relatively prosperous and developed institutionally then became relatively underdeveloped and backward institutionally, and that was part of the consequence of this European colonization. So this was, it was another way of showing that this geography hypothesis didn't work very well. But to talk about that, it was one thing to talk about these historical examples, but then we had to make that much more systematic and quantifiable if we wanted to get economists' attention, I think. So, I love, case studies and just the details, but then, you have to kind of step back and say, is there something systematic here, or is it just something very idiosyncratic about the difference between Barbados and Jamaica or something? So that's what we did. We tried to use these historical estimates of population density, of urbanization, just as a way of, how do I measure relative prosperity in 1500? Well, you could look at urbanization, and that's something which we know is very associated with development. There's a discussion about whether that's true historically, but yeah, so we had to use creativity to come up with different measurements so we could show people this pattern was much more systematic than just these examples. So, yeah.
So coming out of that, one of the things that you're best known for is not merely that institutions matter, but the particular types of institutions that you think are integral to development. Inclusive institutions, you're a big supporter, at least quickly interpreted as a big supporter of forms of government like democracy. And so I wanted to ask you a question about that. Last night you had this nice quote that you relayed from Churchill, who said something along the lines of, democracy is the worst form of government except for everything else. And so I've always interpreted that as something like the following, which is when you have strong state capacity and you have an authoritarian government or a non-inclusive government, how well you do really depends on your policies and your leadership. You can have China in the 1960s and 1970s under Mao, or you can have the various leaders that came after 79 in China, where you do much better, but huge variation. Whereas democracy is, you limit the ability of a leader to do incredibly poorly and incredibly well. It's a protection, it's an insurance system. And so that's how I interpreted Churchill. But last night you expressed something a little bit different than that, which I want you to unpack. So you think that good institutions are democratic institutions, and that it's not merely democracy is not just there for providing insurance, it's necessary for actually succeeding. So can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, because I think, my general view is that, so if you take a very stylized dichotomy between democracy and some authoritarian system, what does that mean? It means that political power is concentrated, narrowly in the hands of some group of people, the Chinese Communist Party, or maybe Hun Sen in Cambodia, or the Argentine military, or whoever it is. Okay, and in a democracy, political power is more broadly spread. But I don't think, I think that, if you're talking about institution building or the provision of public goods, then some narrow elite doesn't have any incentive to do that. They don't need to provide public goods that benefit all the citizens, because they can't benefit from the wealth or the welfare which is created by that. They can't extract the rents from that in some sense. So it's the people who benefit from public goods who have a real interest in getting them provided. So to me, and or the rule of law. Elites don't have any interest in the rule of law. Yeah. So they have an interest in the rule by themselves. They want discretion, and they don't want the laws to apply to them. They want the laws to apply to other people. I was quoting Getulio Vargas yesterday that to my friends, everything. To my enemies, the law. You know, so the law is a tool for keeping people under control. It's not. I'm not subject to the. You know, so I think basic things like that, you can't really expect to have them in a non-democratic society. I understand that democracy is. I try to avoid I talk about the distribution of power. You know, because democracy is a very. You know, when people say democracy, they tend to think of a very specific set of institutions for allocating power, elections, but you can't change the distribution of power in the Congo by holding an election and, going home. There's much more to it than that, much more to do with the mobilization of society and collective action and information. And so I think that you have to think much broader about the way power is exercised to think about what does it mean to say that power is distributed equally, in society or more broadly. I think democracy helps. Democracy setting up elections, it helps. It sort of pushes you in that direction. But I don't think it's sufficient to create, what we call a broad distribution, distribution of power. But that's, of course, what you're saying is true factually. That democracies are much less volatile in terms of income per capita, for instance, so I think that's true as a fact, and that's another mechanism. But I guess that's not where I'd start.
Yeah. So I want to quickly summarize what we do and ask you one last short question. So it's important to have state capacity. It's important to have. It's helpful to have democracy. And then also good policies beyond democracy all go together. But along the way, you've highlighted the challenges of building a strong state capacity, and you're not always guaranteed a democracy. So while we're waiting for that to occur in various places in the world, do you have any thoughts on what are good policies for countries to pursue when they don't have state capacity? We know the good policies to pursue. Economists talk about them. Good policies. Contract enforcement, property rights, et cetera, that are there when you have good state capacity. Do you have any thoughts, or are we still wondering about what to do when there's weak state capacity?
I think that's an open question. I think most of the focus of research is on, if you don't have state capacity, how do you acquire it? A lot of that research is very technocratic. How do we incentivize bureaucrats? How do we get the right people into the state? Or what's the best way to have a fiscal system? Do we want to privatize tax collection? Or, what sort of tax, do we want to have? And income tax, that's complicated. So I think there's very little focus at all on what you're describing, which is to say, you're in the Congo, state capacity, is very weak. And that's something very difficult to change. Maybe it can happen slowly. Where's the project to do it? So take that as given. How does that affect other things we're interested in? What's the best? I don't think there's much systematic research on that. I'm not sure I have a really good answer to that. I guess we could say investing in education is always a good thing. But then, if there's no state capacity and there's no fiscal resources, it's very hard to do. Yeah. So what do you prioritize in a world? What sort of rules or what sort of policies do you prioritize in a world which lacks, in a country which lacks state capacity? I think that's a research agenda, it seems to me. I'm not sure I can even think of a paper that's we haven't systematically thought about that.
Yeah, sounds like a great topic for further research in the next decade or so.
I think it is, yeah.
So with that, let's end. Thank you very much for the time. This was a great conversation.
My pleasure,
and I look forward to reading your next book.
Me too, yes.
Thanks.